it's performance, it's being tactical about doing nice things when people are looking, so you can put money in the manipulation bank. And then, so the narcissistic person can weaponize those nice things they did and use them against you in an argument or to silence you or stonewall you or gaslight you. I'm a nice person. Look what I did.
Do narcissists actually not have empathy? Or do they have empathy and choose not to use it? Let's start by breaking down the central sort of definition of narcissism or even narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the key elements that comes up diagnostically, sort of number one, is that they lack empathy. Okay? Nowhere does it say that they don't have empathy. It says that they have less empathy. So right out the gate, we know that they have some preserved capacity for empathy. All right, well, that's troubling because anyone who's been in a narcissistic relationship will say, it feels like my partner has no empathy. Or more problematic, they'll say, I feel like this person has empathy sometimes, but not all of the time. And that's probably a more accurate depiction. I like to view narcissism as a pattern where there's diminished empathy, but they are definitely not absent of it. They've got it. What is so problematic is that they have empathy. They have the capacity for empathy. But the fact of the matter is, even armed with that, they choose not to use that empathy. That is a slap across the face. So let's break that down. First of all, it's important to understand empathy has two pieces. Number one, it's the piece of attempting to understand, reflect, and be present with the emotions or feelings of another person, even if you're not experiencing them, and perhaps even if you don't necessarily agree with them, that you would understand that a person may be sad or angry or have some other emotional state. But part two of empathy is being able to self-reflect on your impact on other people. So in the simplest example, empathy, the self part of empathy, the self-reflective part of empathy, is taking a minute before you react to someone to think about how your words and how your actions could affect somebody else. Because narcissists often just say and do what they want without thinking, that absence of empathy, the problem is that they hurt a lot of people. Because it's not that they have no empathy, they've got some, they know they've done something wrong. And 2 hours later, 6 hours later, 24 hours later, 5 weeks later, may come back to you to say, yeah, I can see how that made you upset, or I guess I'm sorry I said that. The apologies are kind of hollow, but they are apologies because they get that they did something wrong. But in the moment, their selfish, impulsive need means that they're willing to throw all that empathy stuff out of the window to do what feels right and necessary to them at that moment. But what a lot of people like to believe is that narcissists don't have any empathy, and that's not true. Like I said, they tend to have less. But I would actually argue that a lot of narcissists actually have a fully normal capacity for empathy. Think about your early stage, maybe in a romantic relationship with a narcissist, and you were being love bombed. Or think about when you were on a job working with a very charismatic narcissistic boss or colleague, and how attuned they were to you and remembering little details because they were trying to win you over on something. Or a narcissistic family member who was trying to get you on board with the thing that mattered to them. They were so hyper attuned to you at that moment that obviously they were able to be open and aware to your emotional state. One could argue that what narcissists do with empathy is that they weaponize empathy. Empathy, when used correctly, gives us a lot of information about the other person. It teaches us the sorts of triggers for sadness, the kinds of things that anger them or agitate them, the things that they feel anxious about, and any number of other situations or triggers that bring out strong emotions in a person. If you study that carefully enough, you better believe that you can then use that knowledge to manipulate that person. If you know what gets a rise out of that person, creates emotions out of them, if you're the narcissist and you're aware, which is empathy, of the other person's emotional state, when you need it, you can turn around and use that as a weapon, as a tool, as a way of manipulating them, as a way of getting a rise out of them, and then turning around and gaslighting them and saying, you're being too sensitive. This idea, though, that a narcissist could have a capacity for empathy, but then still be so uncaring and unfeeling, is a really, really difficult idea for people to get their head around. Because when it comes down to brass tacks at that point, what it means is that they really, really just don't care. They're not able to reel in their own reactions, their own responses, their own manipulations, even though you're feeling bad. It's as though when they need you and want you, they are hyper attuned to every feeling you have. But when they've discarded you, when they no longer need you, when you're no longer a convenience for them, then they have no problem just sort of stepping over your body, even if it's lying on the street in front of them. Because with most narcissistic people in our lives, there was at least one, and probably many more than one time, they showed what you experienced and likely was real empathy. They were able to connect with you. When that gets turned off, and you're in the face of somebody who literally doesn't care, that's absolutely chilling. You wouldn't care if somebody in the grocery store wasn't aware of your feelings. Let's say, I don't know, you started crying in the frozen food aisle because it reminded you of an ex-partner and you were very sad. If people just walked by you in the grocery store, maybe that wouldn't feel good, but you wouldn't be hurt by it. Why? Because those people never showed you empathy or feeling before. They're just going about their business. They don't know who you are. And maybe they think they're being empathic by giving you your private moment. It's really unsettling to have someone sometimes get it and sometimes not. You may wonder, at those times they don't get it, that they don't care. Is it just that their empathy is turned off? No. It's that they can't be bothered. It's almost as though exerting their empathy muscle is effortful for them. For a healthy person, it comes naturally. In fact, for a healthy person, if they were in that grocery store, walking by that person in the frozen food aisle who might have been crying, they might have actually stopped and checked in with that person and say, hey, are you okay? Just to make sure. That's empathy. And believe it or not, sometimes narcissists can do pretty good with stranger empathy. In fact, that's something that throws a lot of people off. They'll say, I don't get it. He is so awful to me, invalidating and mean and discarding and cruel and disrespectful. And yet, every time we walk into that coffee shop, he gives the homeless person in the street in front of it, some money. I don't get it. Because stranger empathy is actually not that hard. It doesn't require anything more than a moment of recognition, whether it's asking someone in the street if they're okay, giving them $5. That's actually quick and easy. And for the narcissist, it plays on that communal narcissistic muscle. Aren't I a great person? I just gave $5. In fact, they often may reserve those actions of giving somebody on the street $5 for when they actually have an audience and somebody else is looking at them. They might only do the big tipping when they have an audience and other people are at the table. So this disconnect between somebody who can sometimes have their empathy and use it and sometimes not use it is unsettling. The empathy is always there. It doesn't stop and start. It's always there. It's about implementation. And narcissists are very, very discerning, sadly, about how they use it. It's as though it's something they don't want to give away, but more likely they can't be bothered. If you're in a relationship with somebody, any kind of relationship, intimate, close relationship, marriage, family relationship, parent, sibling, friend, coworker, and the empathy goes up and down and all around, and it's there and it's not, look alive. Because what it likely means is that many, many times your feelings won't be considered. And you want to be very, very careful in those situations to be very, very, very mindful of not showing too many of the cards in your hand, of being very, very careful and guarded with your vulnerability. Because the most dangerous part, as I said, is the narcissist weaponizing empathy, of saying, they have an unbelievable ability to study another person and get the information they need and turn around and use it to harm that person. True love, true respect, that's shown when somebody shares a vulnerability and we don't use it as a weapon. In fact, we protect that vulnerability. We're very careful to not bring up that topic. An example could be, let's say you're a woman and you have children and you have a friend who's going through terrible experiences with infertility. You know that she is envious and jealous, but happy that you have kids, but it's hard for her. And then you get pregnant again, and you're very aware of what that conversation would do to your friend. You would be very mindful of it, you'd bring it up very carefully, you would check in on how she's feeling, but in the same breath too, if you had a friend who was going on and on, oh, I hate kids, I wish I never had kids, and so on and so forth, in front of this friend who was struggling with this, you would be very careful to protect that friend. Maybe by changing the conversation, maybe by taking that insensitive friend aside, but finding a way to protect your friend's vulnerability. That's respect, that's love. And so many people will say, oh my God, I was so open in this relationship with this narcissist. I shared everything with him or her. They made me believe I could share everything with them. And then when the relationship started going off the rails, they took all of that information and they used it against me. Interestingly, the original idea for this video came from somebody who had written me an email. One of our YouTube subscribers, part of our YouTube community, had emailed me, I think from Germany. And she was the one who actually said, you know, you talk a lot about the empathy deficits in narcissists. And she was saying, actually, that's not what the neuroscience shows, that they actually have a fully intact capacity for empathy, which led me to do this deeper dive. And then I reflected on many of the conversations I've had with clients or doing seminars or workshops or even reading the research. And it really, really was such a good point. It is actually worse to be in contact with somebody who has empathy and chooses not to use it than to be with somebody who simply lacks it, a pattern we might see in something like, for example, psychopathy, where they have absolutely no feeling for another human being. So as you think about this, and you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person, guard your vulnerabilities once you realize that they turn their empathy on and off like a switch to their convenience. And you also have to engage in that radical acceptance that, yeah, they may actually not care about your feelings. And to accept that is often a motivator to make some really powerful changes in how you conduct yourself in that relationship. It's an incredibly painful thing to accept, but once you accept it, you're able to set better boundaries, have more realistic expectations, and be more self-protective in relationships that have tremendous potential to hurt you. It stinks to think that somebody would choose to use their empathy at their whim when it's such a critically important human characteristic. But it happens. It's a classical characteristic of narcissism. And if you encounter it, it hurts. Just receive it as the wake-up call. It is. So today we're going to talk about the pseudo-empathy of the narcissist. And I'm going to give you also a very lived example today on this one. So what do you want to know about the pseudo-empathy of the narcissist? It's really important for you to understand this.
So when we think about sort of pseudo empathy, this is something that many of you have experienced. This pattern has been brought to my attention. I've experienced it. I've seen clients experience it many times, but it was just done to me this past weekend. So it is so fresh, and it was really brought into starker focus. Like I was literally experiencing it in real time. Hopefully, because I just went through it, I can make my point much more clear here as a result. So let's talk again about this concept of the pseudo empathy of the narcissistic person. What do I mean by that? One thing we have to remember is that it's actually not completely accurate to say that narcissistic people completely lack empathy. They actually have what's called variable empathy. They turn it on and off to get what they need. So it's not pure empathy, but it's more of a transactional empathy, and it turns on when they're actually having a good day. It also tends to be more of a cognitive empathy, saying things like, I understand why you might feel that way, but they really don't have emotional empathy. Oh my gosh, I can see you're sad. How can I be there for you? Cognitive empathy often doesn't leave us feeling much better or supported. It looks like empathy, but it isn't soothing. It's like Splenda instead of sugar. There's also something else that narcissistic people have, which I term macro empathy. And some of this overlaps with what we call communal narcissism. It's empathy for big groups of people from a distance. So feeling bad for a group of people going through a bad time, wartime, refugees, natural disaster survivors, or even getting into sort of an intellectual polemic about people who do bad things. For example, being angry about all people who abuse vulnerable people. This can also result in them berating the people who are actually around them in real life for complaining about the stresses of their lives. Ugh, how could you complain about your life when there is a war there, or explosion someplace else, or fires burning down this or that? So when you are having real pain or real hurt in your life, the narcissistic person will seem to have tons of empathy for a situation across the world, but have no problem invalidating, diminishing, or gaslighting the emotions or experiences of a person who's standing right in front of them. But to the world, they often look quite empathic because they're so worried about those people on the other side of the world. In my most recent experience that I just had of pseudo macro empathy, this person was criticizing me for being too hard on narcissistic people and not giving them a chance. And ironically, after the call, I reflected my life is a damn living monument to giving narcissistic people too many chances. And my messed up health and mind are the inscription on that stupid monument. But the person said that by me commenting on the rigidity of these relationships and the lack of change that we observe in narcissism, or at least that I observe in narcissism, and most of you do too, that I am not giving the narcissistic people a chance. Then the person proceeded to say about 15 terrible, unempathic things to me. I know it was 15 because I wrote them down as it was happening. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mercifully, I was on the phone, so I was sort of able to ruefully chuckle and roll my eyes without the person seeing me, which would have resulted in 30 more minutes of rage if they did. I actually did not follow my own Dr. Ramani rules, and I did the opposite of deep. I defended, I explained, and I engaged, but I will give myself some props for not personalizing. I laid out statistics and other nonsense to this person. It was a total waste of my Sunday morning. And while in this case, my providing evidence actually did shut this person down, the conversation really made me reflect on this sort of moralistic empathy that this person had for all of the narcissistic people out there. The absence of empathy this person had for me, a person to whom they're very close to. After the conversation, I felt invalidated, tired, wrung out, and as most survivors of narcissistic abuse do, I fell into that thinking of, what if this person's right? What if I am some kind of monster for pointing out these patterns and not being nicer to narcissistic people? Maybe I should be an enabler. And then I went to my inbox and read my emails, and then I was reminded that, yeah, it's probably really important that I keep educating people about narcissistic and antagonistic patterns and the harm that it's doing to them. I'm not sure if the person I was talking to is fully narcissistic. I do believe that this person does dislike me even though they remain in my life, so I think that they were just simply trying to find a way to hurt me. But
the person does have a lot of narcissistic top notes. And I gotta say, this pattern of pseudo macro empathy is one that cuts across narcissistic people. And the conversation was exhausting and tiring. So, this pseudo empathy is often very moralistic and self righteous, and it becomes a tool to minimize one person's experience, a person who's right in front of you, by weaponizing empathy. Weaponizing empathy is kind of awful, right? It's like weaponizing a cute teddy bear. But for narcissistic people, it's easy for them to have empathy for a concept or a struggle that they're not directly in. And since other people only serve as tools for emotional regulation for them, they can use this pseudo empathy for a reason to bash the other people around them across the head and then feel better about themselves because, well, they're only caring about those people who are so far away. The pseudo empathy also creates an environment of enabling. Just as in my conversation where this person is telling me, oh, you're being so mean to narcissistic people. And just as an aside, listen, I'm the first one to say, if anyone with a narcissistic personality wants to do the daily work, be mindful in every interaction, stop using other people to regulate, be self-reflective, recognize that they aren't any more special than anyone else, and recognize the feelings of others, and do that every hour of every day, then yes, change is possible. The problem is that when life stress arises or disappointment happens, as it always does, because this is life, for example, not even being able to get the parking spot they want sets them off. A lot of all of these skills go out the window. The measure of a person is not how nice they are on a good day, but how graceful they are when the chips are down. If a person with a narcissistic personality can commit to this daily work, then change is possible. It's a unicorn, I'll own that. And for the people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse, waiting for the narcissistic person in your life to make substantial change while you keep enduring the abuse is like using the Powerball as your retirement plan. It's probably not going to work out for you. So the challenge is that to other people who do not know a narcissistic person well, okay, they're just meeting them, maybe they're more of an acquaintance. If they hear the narcissistic person sort of yammering on about the plight of other people and how much they're worried and want to give their A game to worrying about these folks, while continuing, by the way, to emotionally abuse the people who are living in the same home as them, these pseudo-empaths can look quite humanitarian and nice to people who don't know them well. That ends up fostering more enabling by other people, just like we see in communal narcissism, and the beat goes on. For survivors of narcissistic abuse who invariably are plagued by self-doubt, these shows of pseudo-macro empathy can confuse the hell out of us and very quickly leave us feeling like we're the bad one. Resist that impulse, that idea that you're the bad one. Sit with it a minute. Recognize that the person who showed you no empathy is showing it to a concept or an issue or people they've never met on the other side of the world, but they're incapable of showing it to the person sitting right in front of them. The capacity for narcissistic people to be empathic about things like issues or groups of people, but not to real living, breathing individuals, is a signature characteristic. And again, something we see that is pronounced in self-righteous and communal narcissists. My belief is that we can evaluate the kind of person someone is by how they treat the person who's sitting right in front of them. It's the only place to start. Don't get snowed by somebody's empathy for other people they don't even know when they have none for the people right in front of them. So this macro empathy or the pseudo empathy is a big problem, and it makes people say, well, it seems like they have empathy for everybody but me. What they have for those other people, I'm not even so sure that it's empathy, but you're absolutely right. They have very little empathy for you.
I'm going to talk about something called performative empathy. As you listen to this video, I'd love it if you could drop in the video notes. You're like, oh my goodness, I know what she's talking about. Maybe throw a few examples if you feel comfortable. But I think some of you are going to really, really get this when I talk about this. It's something more and more clients have been bringing to my attention. And I thought, let me share this with you so we can actually have the word for what's happening in these relationships. Let's talk about this idea of performative empathy. So let's start by talking about empathy. Empathy is the pivot, right, on which this entire narcissism thing turns, isn't it? The absence of empathy, or at least the very inconsistent nature of the empathy, is why narcissism and narcissists really aren't made for any kind of close relationships. People who fall into relationships of any kind with narcissists, though, often have too much empathy, right? I would argue that overall, there isn't enough empathy in the world that we live in right now. And that fact, if us not having enough empathy in the world has really had terrible effects on the world we live in. But the problem is most people in those narcissistic relationships have too much empathy, if that's possible. Yet the narcissistic folks walk around the world believing that they are so empathic, and other people actually believe it. And why is that? How is it that the least empathic people in the world have managed to trick other people into believing that they are empathic and that they themselves, the narcissists, actually believe that they are empathic? How the hell did that happen? Well, it comes down to something I'm calling performative empathy, or we could even call it empathy light. Narcissistic folks are really good at doing things that can sometimes look to the world as being nice and empathic when there is an audience. This is the kind of person who makes a great ceremony out of helping an older person across the street when lots of people are watching, or loudly offers to take out the trash at a dinner party, or rescues a bird and posts it on Nextdoor and social media, or keeps bringing parcels of food to an elderly neighbor, or brings home lots of takeout for everyone. And even all of you are thinking, Dr. Romany, damn, you are cynical, girl. That seems empathic. Aren't those things empathic? Huh? Does it? Let's take that apart. Empathy is meant to be consistent. So that bird rescuer, or that food bringer over, or that trash taker outer, after the people leave the dinner party, or when they are alone with their family or with their employees, the real question is, how do they behave then? Are they empathic then without an audience? If the very same person who is nursing that little bird with an eyedropper is able to be invalidating and raging and demeaning and abusing the people close to them, I'm sorry, then that's just empathy for display. That on display empathy, that's what we call performative empathy. Performative empathy can also come out in behaviors like gift giving. Narcissistic people can actually be really great gift givers. Gifts are really wrapped nicely. They come at the right time. They're actually right on point. They're given with great ceremony. It can sometimes feel really gross to get these gifts, because if after a person has treated you so badly and left you confused or consistently flaked on you and then shows up with a gift, it's sort of like pouring concrete on that trauma bond. Lots of people get really thrown off by this gift giving. Got to tell you, just earlier today, I ripped a check sent to me by a narcissistic family member that was meant to be a gift. It felt great to rip the check. I got to tell you, I needed the money, but I needed the self-respect more. But many people, when they get a gift from a narcissist, they see the gift and then feel guilty, and they start down that justification highway. Oh, I don't know, it's a nice gift. Maybe they aren't so bad, or maybe I'm being unrealistic and my standards are too high. Maybe. And then you pawn off your sense of well-being for a $50 gift card. Your soul is worth more than whatever that gift cost. I can promise you that right now. Now, performative empathy really also plays on the self-blame dynamic. People will often say, maybe I'm the bad person. The narcissist is walking around rescuing all the neighborhood grasshoppers and giving food to the neighbors, and I'm not doing those things. So maybe I'm the narcissist. Maybe I'm the one who doesn't have empathy, and they're actually the good person, like they said. Of course, that leaves out the many years of psychological abuse they unleashed on you. Now, performative empathy is a quick and dirty way for the narcissistic person to brand or position themselves as a good person to other people. We really do get played when we see people do nice things in the moment, like emptying trash or driving people to the airport during rush hour. But the fact is that if they manipulate you afterwards and hold that airport drive over your head for years, not so empathic. But doing the ostensibly nice thing gets the narcissistic person the validation and the admiration they need. The world, sadly, doesn't really understand what empathy really is and misses the depth of it. And so they think taking the trash out or saving a neighborhood critter qualifies as empathy. Empathy is about being present with a person, truly present with all of a person, and being able to respond to their emotions and attempt to understand them and their emotions. Listen, animal rescue and trash emptying optional. Empathy is a much more deep, reciprocal state. Now, remember that empathy is also about, like I said, self-reflection, not just how we treat and be with others. It's about thinking about how our behavior, our words, our gestures, how they impact other people. It's a constant state that we just don't engage in when we want validation or admiration, but rather it's always there to maintain and sustain healthy and reciprocal social connections. Putting out the trash or saving a lizard is not empathy. They're nice things to do, but it's not like a carbon credit. You can't put out the trash to cancel out verbally abusing someone. Yet, in the little tiny transactional brains of the narcissistic person, that's exactly how it works for them, which is why they're shocked when you think they're not empathic. The notion of performative empathy really reinforces the narcissist's self-perception that they're really nice people. And so when you tell them that they aren't being nice, not only does it activate their inadequacy, but also their shame. And then they lash out at other people. And they lash out at you if you perceive them as being anything but a humane and good person. And so they keep doing these performative acts to foster a perception of they themselves as empathic, which they will then hit you over the head with over and over again. Not so empathic. Now, I know some of you are thinking that what I am talking about here sounds like communal narcissism, and you're spot on right. This is definitely the core dynamic of that communal narcissistic pattern, doing good things to get admiration and validation, but not being a nice person, saving things, saving people, giving people elaborate gifts, donating money, buying everyone's dinner, especially when it's expensive, putting out the trash at a party, whatever gets them praised and seen as an empathic savior. But grandiose narcissists do this as well. And certainly self-righteous narcissists do it all the time. Performative empathy is part of all forms of narcissism. Performative empathy is actually really confusing. So I'm giving you a word for it so you don't put it into the bigger empathy bucket. It's a really important distinction. Performative empathy is sort of doing an empathy dance for show. It's not even empathy. It's showmanship or showpersonship. It's performance. It's being tactical about doing nice things when people are looking, so you can put money in the manipulation bank. And then, so the narcissistic person can weaponize those nice things they did and use them against you in an argument or to silence you or stonewall you or gaslight you. I'm a nice person, look what I did. At best, it's empathy light. At worst, it's turning pretend kindness into one more tool of abuse. And the enablers all see it as, look what a nice person they are. So I say, beware narcissists bearing gifts or favors or rescuing or putting out the trash. That performance may not only leave you gaslighted by other people, it muddies the waters and makes those trauma bonds even stronger. Once you see these sort of pseudo empathic moments as performative, you can break out of the cycle of seeing these narcissists as being oh so empathic and seeing yourself as bad for not seeing them as empathic. There's nothing to see. It's not empathy. It's theater. Recognize the difference. And for those of you who got this far in the video, please, if you've ever had this experience of like, oh my gosh, yes, they would do all these things that other people would see, and everyone say, oh, they're so empathic and I'm not. Now you understand the difference, and it helps you see like, this is just that sort of performative dance they do, but it's not the real thing. The real thing, empathy, is a lot quieter. It's a lot more gentle. It's a lot more private. And it's something that's not done to get all that validation and all those likes, but something we do from that connected space within us to protect and take care of people we care about and even people we're just getting to know.
So I'm going to take on such an interesting question today because it's something that's come across to me a few times, and I'm actually really looking forward to hearing the comments on this one or reading comments on this one, because it's a question, and it's basically the gist of the question is, do narcissists really believe when they walk around thinking and saying that they're empathic and kind and compassionate? Do they really believe it when they walk around saying that I'm such a great person? That's the question. So what do you think? Do you really think that they believe it? Have you ever had a narcissistic person come up to you and say, I am so empathic? Do you think they really believe it? You want to know the answer? Yes, they do. So, one of the more galling and frankly gaslighty experiences that can happen when we are with narcissistic people is not just when they are emotionally abusing the hell out of us, but when they actually feel and say that they're wonderful, kind, generous, patient. And my favorite is when the narcissistic folks say that they're empathic and they really mean it. So if you were to look at them and laugh or sort of look at them sideways, like you think they're joking, they will rage at you because they don't see themselves as bad. They actually see themselves as all of those wonderful things. So, how many of you have tolerated this? How many of you have had the narcissistic person around you talk about how great and nice and patient and compassionate they are? Drop that in the comments. It helps to see that we are not alone. I have had that happen so many times. Now, you all may be thinking, Dr. Romani, what about all that talk you make about narcissistic people being insecure? That stuff is so deep and unprocessed for them. Because obviously, if they were actually in touch with being insecure, then they could be engaging in the healthy and vulnerable work and understand that their antagonistic, mean, and cruel behavior is a defense. And then they could lean into the vulnerability and not be unkind. And let me tell you, that is a very, very, very rare sequence. And if you've ever seen that happen, a narcissist getting in touch with their vulnerability, then basically you're holding a moon rock. Now, what happens more often is if they behave badly and that bad behavior is judged badly by other people, that bubbles up those feelings of inadequacy and then the shame, and then a likelihood of lashing out at the person who brought the shame out of them, and then shifting the blame onto that person rather than owning it. You know this whole narcissism shame blame sequence, right? So instead, narcissistic people maintain a very rigid and self-unaware thought process that they're great people. This drives and is driven by the grandiosity, and it looks like a staggering lack of insight, which it is, because if they don't walk around touting their wonderfulness, then the alternative, that they are mean and unkind and unempathic and demanding, well, that's too destabilizing for them to get on board with. If you say something to yourself often enough, you believe it, for better or worse. And that is the case for them. They walk around saying, look how empathic I am. The issue is that the entire experience of them touting their virtuousness or their patience or their empathy and compassion can feel like a massive gaslight for the people around them, who may feel confused at how this person, who is actually very unkind,
yet holds on to the party line that they're such a great person. It can even lead the people around the narcissist, because the narcissist is so insistent on saying that they are such a great person. The people around the narcissist actually start doubting themselves and wonder if maybe they're the bad people for viewing the narcissistic person so uncharitably, since the narcissist themselves is so convinced that they're such a great person. It's a big mind, you know what. This effectively ends all communication with a narcissist, because there's no way to give a narcissistic person feedback. It's like pouring water onto like a really hard surface, I don't know, like granite or something, and expecting it to get absorbed. It doesn't, it just sort of rolls off. In fact, if you do give feedback to the narcissist, you'll be met with rage. At a conscious level, you are telling them what they truly believe is untrue. They do believe that they're good, patient, kind people. At an unconscious level, you are activating their inadequacy and their shame. But all paths take you to the same destination, which is uninhibited rage. I have worked with many couples over the years where there was clearly one narcissistic person in the relationship. The narcissistic member of the couple would often hold their ground on just what good people they were and how nice they were, how devoted to the relationship, that they were just a great person. I would often see the other person sort of twitching and shaking their eyes and making their eyes so wide, and at some level welcoming that there was a witness in the room. Now, to provide a realistic framing, I would sometimes bring up and talk about the behavioral patterns that were showing up, and that the other person, the not narcissistic person in the relationship, might have experienced as not being particularly nice or kind, and try to help the narcissistic person in the relationship understand, at a minimum, the experience of their partner. Even if we couldn't get into the buy-in of the idea that no, they're not empathic or kind, right? We were never going to get there. Now, 9 times out of 10, I would be faced with deflection, blame shifting, be accused of splitting hairs, taking sides. Ultimately, the narcissistic person would never end up taking ownership of what was happening, and wouldn't budge on that self-concept of them being such a great and kind person, even when the behavior didn't line up, and typically would then stop showing up to therapy. I long ago stopped doing couples work where narcissists are involved. I had this happen in a recent dealing with a narcissistic person in my life. I'll share that with you. This is a person who, on a standard level, is quite angry, egocentric, arrogant. They're very accustomed to always getting their way, very frustrated when they don't get their way, very gruff, very impatient. The person's impatience was causing problems for somebody else. And that person doesn't tend to speak up. So I said, I want to talk to you. And I hinted at the difficult person's impatience and said, they may want to work on that, because the situation at hand was going to require lots of patience. Oh my goodness. The narcissistic person just went off on me. I mean, they went off. I wasn't even calling them out as an awful person or anything, which they really are an awful person. I merely was suggesting that given the situation, that they and all of us needed to up our patience game. And I then received a litany of texts about how they were the most patient person in the world, the most tolerant person in the world, the most generous person in the world, none of which was true. And I could literally come up the top of my head of hundreds of behavioral examples supporting how untrue it was. And then they attacked me for being hostile and making a difficult situation worse, and for being a rotten person. It was so stunning, because this person is so impatient, so selfish, and their conception of themselves They really believed that they were patient and giving and kind. It was a complete distortion. And that right there is so much of what the experience of narcissism is, right? It's all a big distortion. It meant that the difficult situation was going to require workarounds on the narcissist and reminded me for about the 10,000th time that these folks do not change and do not respond well to feedback that punction or that sort of that punctures their distorted sense of what great people that they are. A reminder that any form of feedback or conversation, in this case, in this particular case for me with this impatient narcissist, was pointless. It just caused me more grief. And perhaps I had a tiny glimmer of hope, not that this person would change, but rather that maybe there was a smoother path forward to solve this larger problem that was looming. I should have known there wasn't. And I should have just simply recognized that. And that I knew that I should have known that I'd have to work around this person all along. It ended up costing thousands and thousands more dollars and hours. I had wanted to avoid that, obviously, but it was unavoidable. Having narcissistic people in our lives is not only painful and heartbreaking, but it can also be quite expensive. Now, the reactive sensitivity to feedback or criticism that narcissists have is a cardinal quality that we see across narcissistic folks. Obviously, because it flies in the face of their self-schema of being such great people, right? They're convinced of that. Now listen, as recently as a month ago, I was still trying to go in and give the gentle feedback, and it's a mess. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. What's interesting is that there is research showing that narcissistic people have been found to have an inaccurate assessment of themselves. They tend to view themselves as being better people than they actually are, as more successful, more empathic, and their self-esteem is actually kind of off kilter in terms of the kind of people that they actually are. So while the rest of us typically walk around with our own distorted sense of self, typically because we devalue ourselves, we speak badly about ourselves, narcissistic folks, at least when they're asked about it, will share the most glowing assessments of themselves. I have to say, without exception, every narcissistic client I have ever worked with clinically has viewed themselves as great, humanitarian, generous people who are empathic and who don't get a fair shake from the world, and that the world doesn't see how great and generous that they are, and that the world always takes advantage of them without exception. I've seen that. And their self-concept was so inaccurate. They were so unempathic and they thought of themselves as empathic. It was so inaccurate, it almost bordered on delusion. Now, some of you may be thinking, but the vulnerable narcissist, Dr. Ramani, they don't think of themselves as great, do they? It's an interesting sort of a twist. Ostensibly, a lot of vulnerable narcissists may sometimes speak of themselves in devaluing terms. Nobody likes me. I haven't done anything great with my life. Nothing is really going the way I want it to. But then they twist it into, I don't deserve this because I'm so nice. So it still comes back to the idea of how good and wonderful they are, and the sense that the world is not equipped to see how great they are. And they're doing unkind things to other people and still walk around thinking that they're so kind. Now, communal and self-righteous narcissism are also based on this sort of distortion. The communal narcissist engaging in their humanitarian and charitable behaviors to bolster their sense of being so giving and so great, and not integrating this idea that they are abusive to people emotionally. The self-righteous narcissist proclaims their moral goodness, not recognizing that the judgment that they hold over everyone is so toxic and damaging. Both of these types of narcissists just think that they are the bee's knees and the best righteous rescuing people around. This pattern of them thinking they're so great and empathic, it really messes with our minds because the narcissistic folks are fiercely holding on to a self schema that is so inaccurate. And so we have to recognize that there's going to be no hope of progress or change. But it also means that we have to be careful to not be talked out of our experience of the person either. Just because a person tells you that they're just the nicest person out there, that doesn't and shouldn't negate the difficult and invalidating experience that we are having with them. And when someone is proclaiming to be such a great, kind person, I mean, first of all, it's bizarre that they'd be proclaiming that, but look for the deliverables. Are they actually doing nice things? Most of us, frankly, undervalue ourselves. So it's actually quite easy to be swayed by the narcissist's confidence and resoluteness and commitment to how great and nice and empathic and giving that they are. Hard as it may be, we have to commit to not letting their self-proclaimed greatness to mess with our heads. And when the narcissistic people in your life are talking about how great and giving that they are, do everything you can to get that ironic smirk off of your face, because trust me, it's not worth their rage. And I'll tell you, most people, when the narcissistic person is talking about how empathic that they are, a lot of people are saying, what am I missing? You're not missing anything. That distortion, that distorted self-esteem, that distorted sense of self that is drilled down so deep in them that they really seem to believe it, can mess with your head. Yep, they're going to walk around and say it. Just because you say something doesn't mean it's true. Thanks again.